Hello to everyone. Welcome to the eighth Presence XR webinar. We are delighted to have you with us. Shortly, the webinar chairs will introduce our guest speaker. Be please aware that we are recording this session for our project website. Questions will be addressed during the final part of the presentation. You are welcome to submit them through the Q&A box, or alternatively, you may raise your hand at the end of the discussion to ask the question directly. Anna and Anthony, the stage is yours.
Hi, everyone. So I'll just introduce Michael Wiesing. So Michael Wiesing is a postdoctoral researcher at the Event Lab within the Faculty of Psychology at the University of Barcelona, working with Professor Mel Slater. So he comes from a car mechanic background. He studied biology and clinical neuroscience before earning his PhD in psychology from the University of Cologne, where his thesis focused on object-based attentional expectancies in virtual reality. After his PhD, he worked as a postdoc in experimental psychology at the University of Dusseldorf, focusing on sensory-motor interactions, the sense of agency, and motion sickness. So regarding presence, the Presence Project, he's involved in various presence evaluation studies about which he will talk about today. So over to you, Mihail.
Hey, thanks for the introduction. Let me share my screen. Okay, and about as many as I can in the way. Could I hide it again? Here. Okay, everyone can see the presentation?
It's okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Martin.
Yeah. So, okay, the title today of my presentation was Integration and Applications. I kept the title because it was announced like that, but I think Presence Evaluation would be the better title in retrospect, just as a small detail. So, yeah, I want to talk about the research that we do for for the presence evaluation here in Barcelona. And at first, I want to start and come back to what was last week talk about. Anna presented last week a study that we do with EEG, where three players play a cooperative game and want to measure co-presence, so the sense that you share a space with other people. I will not go here into detail. It was all presented. But there's one aspect where when you want to do neuroscientific research with VR, where things become complicated because we work with tools which are not designed for research. We use game engines like Unity, which are meant for games. Also, the headset is for games and sports, and not for research being designed. And when we measure activity in the brain, then often it depends on what we want to measure, but often we want to exactly know when something happens in the virtual environment and to synchronize it exactly with what's going on in the brain. So to synchronize these data streams, so stimuli on the one side and the neural activity, and things in the brain are going pretty fast. So ideally, we can really say, okay, in that on 1 millisecond accuracy or 2 or 3 milliseconds accuracy, that we can say in that moment something happened. So we can now look into the brain, what's going on there, to learn how does the brain respond to this specific event. And in non-VR research, we usually use tools which are designed for this kind of research. But like I said, in VR, we use game engines, and here we run into specific problems. And uh, this problem comes mainly from how the rendering works. So we render complex 3D scenes, and this takes time. Rendering a single frame on Quest 3 is about 50 plus minus milliseconds that the whole processing takes. Um, and what happens here is that at first in Unity we have input processing physics and so on, so stuff going on, and then everything goes to the GPU, and then the VR runtime like OpenXR takes over, does the GPU, the 3D rendering, the actual one. And then at some point we get here, for example, an error feedback that we use in this previous study. I forgot to mention this, but like we want to know like when, for example, an error feedback is given. And this is a moment when this actually happens, when the display lights up with our stimulus. But the problem is that our logic happens here at the beginning. So this is where our scripts, our code is for the experiment, and where we, for example, execute a function, say, no error. But if you would just say, okay, we execute the function here, and now we look at that moment in the corresponding brain data, then we would look way too early before the participant received this feedback. So the problem is here then that we look at the wrong time. Um, and to solve this, what we have an approach here to solve this, and this is based on the fact that this kind of time that we need for rendering is not just a problem if you want to do when you want to do something like EEG, but also for the rendering itself, because it takes time, and this increases the time between you make a movement and the headset, the display changes. So the so-called motion to photon latency, which gets increased. And to reduce the latency between your movement and the display change, what every VR system does is they look how you move and they predict your movement forward so that they anticipate at that time what you will see at this time based on how you move right now. And this works most of the time pretty well and gets a big chunk of latency reduced, which is important here. And to come back to our problem for the synchronizing of brain data and the VR scenario, we can use this kind of prediction as well, not for how participant moves, but just to predict here that time. And during my PhD, I already made a study about this approach, where I described the problem and also how to solve that back then with Unreal Engine and with SteamVR. And I could show that works really well and it solves this asynchrony quite well. The problem back then was not just that it's Unreal Engine and SteamVR, and today I work with OpenXR and Unity, but also that the way it was coded was a proof of principle. Like I'm not a real programmer, and I get code working, but it's not maybe nice code at the same time. So here, for example, it's involved that you need to download a custom source code branch from Unreal Engine and compile it from source for this to work. And something like that should be a simple plugin that you install in your project, and then you can get this timestamp that is missing right now. And fortunately, we have in the lab better programmers than me, especially Alex, one of our PhDs, who did actually do this, and he wrote a plugin for Unity that's easy to install, and this is basically one line of code, and you know when your stimulus appears. And this is something we tested also with a procedure called self-validation and a device called the black box toolkit, which is here in the middle. And this black box toolkit is basically a participant. We can attach sensors to it, like a photo sensor that we can attach to a head-mounted display. Here, this figure is, by the way, from my old study. In the new study, we used the Quest 3 and not an HTC Vive, but the rest principle is from the measurement the same. So we can measure when does something happen on the display and can then send a signal back to the computer and measure here this measurement error that we have. So how much too early or too late are we taking this timestamp? And this works because here we have a machine that works really always in the way you program it. And you can tell, okay, and you treat it basically like a participant in a reaction time experiment. You show a white screen, it gets detected by the photo sensor, then this machine waits for a specified duration, and then it elicits a button press. And then we know here for the duration that we specified, like we can say, press a button after 300 milliseconds, then we should measure here 300 milliseconds. And everything that is different from these 300 milliseconds is a measurement error. So this is here, this logic. And this device is also controlled by another computer just to avoid interference here with the rendering. So it would maybe make some rendering slower and then increasing errors. Um, and we did this here in different configurations now with Quest and for 1000 times. So 1000 times where we showed a white display and then sent a signal back to the computer and look what the errors are. And here's the version which I call the naive version. So we don't use our plugin or anything else. We just use Unity how a game developer would do it. Because for a game developer, when you want to do something like a reaction time task, and this is what we have here, then you don't care about millisecond precision. But if you would look into the brain, then this is a huge problem here that we are like 62 milliseconds off. So like if the real duration would be 300 milliseconds, what you would measure here would be 362. And this in a range plus minus 10 milliseconds. So there's quite some noise in there. And this is for something like this event-related potential that we do in EEG, the best approach. So we want to have better precision for that. And now we tested the same with our plugin to predict the stimulus onset and also to have a custom routine to process button presses. So this is also game engines are notoriously bad in high sampling rates for button input. And with both together, and then when we use the headset connected with a cable to a PC, we get this error down to 1 millisecond, plus minus one roundabout. And this is what we want to have in this kind of research. Um, Although in our study that we are working on, we won't connect the headsets to computers. This will run on Quest 3 in standalone, which makes the setup a bit more complicated because we still need a custom input system. We don't use the controllers, and which adds a bit of error because we have more data streams. But here still, when we run it on Android, the error range and the mean error are still all in a range that we can work with. And it's a huge improvement here. Um, and the good thing is, it's like I said, it's really easy to implement. Um, but one problem that we have here right now, I told you we have this custom input devices. We don't use controllers because they are not as precise, and we just quickly tested that in two different ways. So we have here one way where you have a robotic finger that can be connected to the black box toolkit and press a button at a specified time. But since it's a mechanical device, it has some irregularities, and don't trust the data so much, honestly. So instead, to have a second test, what I did was I took an old Quest 2 controller, took it apart, and soldered two cables onto the main board, and then you can electronically, without having to manually press a button, elicit a button press, and which reduces latencies. But regardless of which measurement method we use here, the button presses have huge errors, and this is already taking the prediction into account. This is just the button error. So there are a huge jitter and a huge error, so, which is why we don't use the controllers here. Participants in the experiment need to give button input from time to time, and just like with visual stimuli, we want to know when exactly does this happen, to know when we need to look into the brain to analyze the data. Um, but this to this time measurements, yeah, and to this study that you already heard on. We of course have more studies around presence evaluation and presence evaluation. First of all, we look at, or one important aspect that we look at is the so-called four illusions of VR. So when you're in VR, then usually you quickly have this idea or this feeling that you're really there. You know the place is not real, but it feels like you're really there, which is something we call place illusion. Or plausibility is something that when the environment behaves in an expected way, people respond to you like they would do in reality, and things work like in reality, then we have the feeling that these events are really happening. This is plausibility. Or co-presence, when we have this feeling we share the space with someone else. Or finally, body ownership, which is the illusion that in VR we cannot see our own body. So we need to replace it with an avatar. And here we can also have this feeling that this is really our body. One second. So in these beside other things, some aspects we want to look into, and we want to find out that this technology that is developed here in the Presence project, like the haptic devices like holoportation or other avatars and intelligent virtual humans, if they improve these kind of illusions, or generally if they improve the VR experience. And this is basically the job that we do here in Barcelona. So we wait for the others, or the other project partners develop fancy technology, and we test, does it make it really better or not. Um, and to measure things like presence, or place illusion, plausibility, etc., the typical way is to use questionnaires. So you put someone in VR, and afterwards you ask, okay, how much did you have the feeling that you were really at this place, or that things were really happening? How much did you have the feeling that this was really your body? And this is something we do in basically every experiment. We have lots of questions after an experiment, including also one open question where participants should write some short essay where they can write whatever they want about their experience during the experiment. And this can be used in two ways. One thing is we can do something called sentiment analysis, so we can analyze uh, the, these essays for words with some emotional valence, and we could see, for example, analyze if people use more positive or more negative words and get then information or feedback if they like the scenario, for example, they experienced. But another really and often overlooked aspect of these essays is because people can write what they want. Often they write odd things that happen during the experiment, like there was a tracking error or something that you don't observe when they are in VR, and what the participant during the experiment might not mention. But later you have this in the text, and this can help you also to detect bugs or to exclude people because there was something happening that was unintended. So, but on top of these, let's say, traditional methods to evaluate things like presence, what we also do is something called adaptive multimodal matching, and this is a method where we can step by step change things in the environment to approach a certain target state. So, like we want to improve the environment that people feel more comfortable, and then we change something, and we can ask people, "Do you feel more comfortable?" And do this repeatedly, and we can learn. Uh, how we need to change an environment to increase comfort, or we need to change the environment to increase presence, for example. This might sound now all a bit cryptic, but I will explain it a bit more detail. But first, I want to give something that is, in my opinion, similar and something that I did in the past often. And this is called psychophysics. And psychophysics is something you do as a cognitive neuroscientist, for example, to detect detection thresholds, so like how loud needs a sound to be that you can hear it, for example. Um, and I use, for example, psychophysics to investigate visual illusions, like this illusion here, which is the so-called Müller-Lühr illusion. I guess everyone has seen this before, and typically people estimate the object on the left side to be bigger than the one on the one on the right side. Although both here, the spoiler, you can see they're both the same, and it's the effect of these arrowheads that make this illusion effect. And here you could now use psychophysics to test how strong this illusion is, which is interesting in this sense because this illusion it's a subjective experience. So also not everyone has this kind of illusion effect. Some people have it stronger, some less. And psychophysics can here be used to get this window into the mind here a little bit. And what you would do is you would show participants this both objects and ask them which one looks bigger. So here they would probably say the left one looks bigger. And then you repeat it and you change the side on the right side, the size on the right side, for example, and make it much smaller. So here probably the participants will all be able to clearly see that this is definitely bigger on the left side. And you can test the opposite, where participants would clearly see this is bigger on the right side this time. But then you also have these steps in between where the difference might be more subtle. And you test all of these kind of combinations. And at a certain point, participants are not able to differentiate, say, which one is bigger, but they have to. So we always say, even if you don't see a difference, you need to guess. And then for some specific combinations, then what you observe is that people have chance levels. So they guess, and sometimes they say left, sometimes they say right, or while for the other comparisons, this is more coherent. And this is then the so-called point of subjective equality, where we can say, okay, here they are guessing, so it looks the same. And then we can look and compare both stimuli and see here that the right one is now a certain amount bigger, like, I don't know, like 5-10% bigger than the left one. So there would be an illusion effect of 5% of perceived size difference. And coming back to multimodal matching, um, this is basically, it's similar. It's not the same, especially because it's for complex settings and not for these isolated small features, but for complex settings. But at the same time, it's to systematically try to observe to make subjective states measurable. Um, and we have done here this experiment, which was based on the idea. Probably most of you have played some VR games in the past, and maybe some have played some scary, some horror games, and will agree that VR can be quite frightening and intense. To me, it's way more intense to have a VR game than watching a horror movie, for example. And we were wondering what is now with all these mixed reality headsets where we see reality blended with virtual objects. How does this behave? Because suddenly we are in the real world, but have maybe the same dangerous, threatening virtual stimulus. And is this more intense in reality? And to test this, we first started and made three different rooms. So here we have our laboratory. This is just a real room, how it was visible in mixed reality. Copy of this room, but completely virtual, no mixed reality, and a random virtual room, which doesn't look like the real room. Um, and we had a bunch of different animals, some more scary, some less scary. And the last thing was we had this Newton treadle, and this could be on and off. And in we exposed participants in each trial of the experiment to one combination of these three. So they were in one room, the treadle was on and off, and there was one animal. So like you can see here in this video. And then participants, so they were here in one option, like in the rear room with the wolf, and the cradle was not moving. And then at some point, we changed one of these three factors. In this case here now, we will, in a moment, change the environment. And now it's a virtual environment. It's the same room, but rendered in 3D. And now we would ask participants, do you feel more or less comfortable? So participants did this whole procedure twice. So in one session, they were always asked, do you feel more comfortable here? And when they say yes, we keep the change that we just offered. If they say no, we go back to the previous state. And the second time we did the opposite and we asked, do you feel more uncomfortable? So in the one condition, we try to find the best combination where the less discomfort happens, and in the other, the worst condition. Um, So here, this is, by the way, we cut it. It's not one complete session, but just to show the different combinations. And the participants did this really often and repeatedly had the different kind of options they could choose from. And what we then did was we noted every trial what were the options they had and what did they choose. And here our video is almost on in the end. This is the last room, the last environment. So, and what you now can do when you let someone do this really often and you get a lot of data for these decisions is to analyze this and to calculate. Uh, you can calculate so-called show this in a second, so-called Markov chains, which are uh, which you can use to calculate probability distributions. And in this case, the probability, like when participants are in the block where they should increase the stress, you can analyze and calculate how likely is it that at the end of the experiment they will end up in a certain configuration. And then you get something called the stationary probability distribution. So here we have all the combinations from the increased stress block. Here's a decreased stress block with this distribution. And this is totally overload, but the table because we have all the different combinations that we have here. But what this simply means is we have here, if you would add up all these probabilities, the sum would be one because the participant is always in one of these combinations. But if you would look at a random point or after the experiment, where do they end up then? And 25% when they should increase the stress, they end up with a wolf in mixed reality and the cradle is on. And here you have for all these combinations, we have then these probabilities. But like I said, this is of course a lot of data and it's not really digestible. But we can already learn from here that, like we expected, like the wolf is more stressing than for example, the dog. So here it's the wolf first of all, most of the time here mostly they have the dog and the squirrel. Um, and like I told you, the hypothesis here was that we expect more stress in the mixed reality condition. So we can make this all a bit more digestible if we reduce these numbers. Just we look at the wolf, we ignore all the other animals, and we also ignore the cradle state and we collapse the probability. So we just look how likely is it that after in the end of the experiment that we end up with a wolf plus mixed reality. in the or plus experiment room or plus the alternate room in the one or the other block. And what we can see here in the decreased stress block, the chances that the wolf ends up in any of these rooms is quite low because no one wants to, people don't choose the wolf, they prefer the dog, for example, for decreasing stress. But for increasing stress, they switch to the wolf. And here our hypothesis was essentially that this condition, the wolf, the most threatening animal in the mixed reality condition, would be the most stressing one because it's in the real environment. And numerically, the result here is also like that. Like in 35%, this is really where they end up. But if we compare to the two other rooms here, then the experiment room, so this replication of the real lab, is actually quite close from the probability. And this is something we didn't expect at first. On the other hand, this random virtual room is quite far away from these two combinations. So here it's more than 60% that that in the end you are in the wolf and one of these rooms. And what I think what happened here is that basically our hypothesis is partially correct. So if a threatening stimulus is uh, attached to experience in the real world, it's more threatening than in VR. But I think what we did here, and this is something I didn't expect at first, I didn't think of at first when we started this experiment, but what we essentially do, we represented this room here directly at this location. So it's more like an overlay that we put over reality instead of presenting an alternative reality. So participants knew that even this is all rendered, um, that the reality underlying looks mostly the same. So we were wrong in the sense here that the display modality VR versus MR is what makes a difference, but it's the link to reality. So if you are in mixed reality and there is a dangerous stimulus, or you are in the situation where you are in a room that represents the real room, um, then this is more stressful than in a random environment. And this generally suggests that uh, all these horror VR games, for example, all these things will be possibly also more intense if you have something in mixed reality and there's a zombie in your living room than in a random virtual environment, which has, for example, important implications of what kind of scenarios we design and so on. Um, but enough of that study. I hope that here the idea of multimodal matching got a bit more clear. So it's really that we change things in the environment, or we change something and then we ask participants, do you want to keep that change in order to reach a certain state, like the most stress-less version of the configuration, for example. Um, because it's important to understand here a bit how this works, because we use this also in the upcoming experiments we are working on right now, where I would talk now about. Um, I already mentioned that our job is basically to test if these technologies developed in presence improve the VR experience. And one of the technical pillars for present is body representations. So here on the left side, we have basically the standard way. We have a standard avatar, and we can animate it, and but it's if we created avatar of a person here, it should look like me, like a little bit. But in the end, it's always you lose a lot of things like facial expressions, even if you animate the face, are never or rarely as clear or as detailed as reality. And in presence, one of the technical pillars is full portation, which is basically maybe the next level how we create avatars. Um, so instead of pre-creating an avatar and then animating it, we put someone in front of a camera and or more cameras, and then we uh, directly create a point cloud representing that user. So here you have all the facial details. You see the facial expressions, the finger movements, and so on. Something that is often missing with normal motion capturing or normal avatars, or it's often not as pronounced. And yeah, this experiment that we are planning here is now the question: do people prefer the one or the other form of avatar? And the experiment is what we call the TED Talk experiment. here the avatar I mean, I've seen it, my avatar quite a while. It's just a placeholder. It will not be me being on the stage, but we will have participants in the audience listening to a talk about procrastination. The topic was chosen because in the end, the participants will be students, and it should be something that is interesting to participants. If we talk about something super technical and they lose interest after 1 minute and don't pay attention to the talk anymore, they don't pay attention to the speaker. And this is one of the important questions here. What do people prefer for the representation of the speaker, of the presenter, and of their own avatar? So during this talk, while the speaker is presenting, the participant can from time to time change either their own body representation between holoportation, a normal realistic avatar, or a stylized comic style avatar, and the same for the person on the stage. And here then we can analyze what do they prefer. And I wouldn't, for example, be surprised if in the end we would find that the self avatar, that people prefer the standard realistic ones, because right now holoportation it's quite new technology, and like always there are lots of small things where you have artifacts. You could see some artifacts here in this slightly wave occlusion and so on. And I could expect that for yourself, maybe you want to have a more stable representation. But for the presenter on stage, I think teleportation is what could win here, because it can way better represent the facial expressions and everything than we can do with animated avatar. And for the multimodal matching here, the interface that will be used in this study and also in the other studies I talk a bit later about, is here participants will wear this kind of watch, and whenever they can decide if they want to change an avatar or not, the controller vibrates, and when you look at the watch, then this holographic display here appears, and we can here ask, so do you want to switch the avatar? Yes, no. If they say yes, we switch the avatar. If they say no, we don't. Um, and this is then during the talk repeatedly happening, and they always have to decide. And then consequently, if they decide to change the avatar, we change it or we keep it the same. Um, and for this experiment, basically most of everything is there. We have a talk with slides and a complete script, what to say, what to talk about. But we have one thing right now where we have kind of a solution, but it's maybe not perfect yet. And this is for this kind of experiment, we should ideally record motion capturing, so any normal animated avatar and the holoportation presentation at the same time. Um, the problem is one thing you could do is let me start differently. So the problem is that when we use two tracking systems, with most tracking systems, there could be interference. Like often you have reflective markers on your body for motion capturing, which would interfere with the holoportation cameras. Or also, if you wear a tracking suit for motion capturing, this tracking suit will be also visible in your holoported recording. So then there would be someone in a tracking suit being on stage, for example. Um, but the problem is we cannot just go and say we record both individually. So someone gives the same presentation once with holoportation and then with motion capturing. Because in the end, even if someone really sticks to the script and tries to do both presentations always the same, there will be always some differences. And one chance would be, for example, that the second time they present this presentation, that they are a bit more fluent, it's a bit better explained, and so on. And in the end, participants would not choose the avatars because of the avatar likes, but maybe just because the presentation with holoportation was chosen. It's chosen because the presentation itself is better. It's more interesting to listen to. And this is something we can avoid if we can measure both at the same time. And here's one short video clip of a test we had recently. There was Stefano and Elena from AutoCAD came to the lab, and here this guy is Jorgos, is a lab member from our lab, who is the lead of this project, where we did some tests that we can do motion capturing and holoportation at the same time. And I mean, while it's still not perfect, like for example, here you see the hands from the holoported version are often missing and quite noisy, but this was just a test setup, and we used hollow quotation just with one single camera. Adding another camera here from a different angle would here avoid this occlusion problem, and the hand should be quite fairly well be there. Um, then another problem that we have right now is here the animation. There it seems to be like a bit of a retargeting issue. Um, so you see there is a bit, the pose is a bit different, but this is probably something where we need to calibrate and adjust things here for the setup. Um, but otherwise we have facial expressions. What is currently the only real technical limitations are hand movements at the moment. So like the tracking system that we use here for the motion capturing is camera based and it doesn't move individual finger movements. But one way we could solve that would be we could manually animate the hands, for example. But here, I mean, we have a lot of people here I know who are interested in the art of experience. So I'm also happy to hear suggestions if there are some systems, something that could help here and improve the quality. Um, I just checked the time and I see I need to make a bit quicker. So let's switch to the next experiment. One another technical pillar of present are intelligent virtual humans, so AI-controlled avatars, which you can talk to, and which also respond with their body and so on to what's going on. And there was recently already a webinar on this, so I will not talk about the intelligent virtual humans itself, but about an experiment that we have planned and are working on with University of Hamburg, with Kelly from Hamburg, and also with John from Artenim, to use multimodal matching to optimize social nonverbal behavior, like, for example, the duration the character is looking at you, or how often they are looking at you, or how close they are standing to you. These are all things where we in our daily life quite good to don't stare at someone, don't go too close. We have a feeling for that, but computer characters need to be trained, let's say, on that. And this is what we basically want to do. And participants come here to the lab and they will get museum tours through this museum, like through this room, for example, with different kind of scientists. And the tour guide will be a computer intelligent virtual human. And during the first like half of the tour, we do multimodal matching. So like before, there is this UI panel on watch, and participants can then change different aspects of how the character behaves. Or we offer some change and they can accept it or refuse it. And here, the idea is then that participants can optimize the social behavior to make this conversation, this interaction more natural or more comfortable, also that it's not threatening, that you feel safe. Um, but with one important difference to the previous studies, like in the study with the dog and the wolf, we analyzed everything to get some group value. So we looked for the whole group, which is the most threatening stimulus, most threatening configuration. But here we had a lot of discussions about this experiment and these aspects like eye contact or body distance or proximity. And there are lots of things where people are different here. Like we have cultural differences where there are different norms for what is normal with distance between people, or how intense or exaggerated facial expressions are. And also in the same culture, people like maybe people who are on the autistic spectrum prefer less long eye durations, eye contact durations. So here in this experiment, we don't want to find an overall one size fits all settings, but we want to each participant optimizes, adjusts with multimodal matching the behavior of the tour guide. And then after this multimodal matching, the tour will go on and the virtual character either follows the modifications here that we adjusted, or they ignore what they just learned and they just stick to the default settings. And then we can test if modulating here these factors improves personalizing this improves the experience and makes it more natural and so on. Um, and I have here
How
a
can I
quick
help you today?
video. So here you see a intelligent virtual human. We are right now working on the animations, or especially Joanne is working on that. So this is mainly right now the interface. You can talk to it, they respond to it, and they have awareness of the scene.
Certainly. I see a man in a red hoodie and jeans standing in what looks like a museum exhibit area with display.
Okay, please, could you please give me an introduction of the museum in Chinese?
I will skip that part. So we have
Could you
different
also
languages.
speak it in German?
Gern.
Different
Dies ist
languages.
ein ausstellungsbemusterten Boden und roten Wänden.
Okay, you describe what the person is doing now.
The person in the red hoodie is now looking to their right.
All right. Okay, see you. Bye.
Goodbye. Have a
Um,
great time.
so you can see there is a lot of things to do, and also ignore that there's half of the museum missing. The museum is complete. This is just a test environment. But there are a lot of things we need to do, but we already have a character. We can just talk with the latencies are okay. It doesn't feel weird, and the character has awareness of the scene. They can see. Um, but like I said, right now, then we are now working on the animations and on these behavioral parameters we want to manipulate. Then we can hopefully soon start with that study.
How can I
And
help you
now
today?
uh, I need to rush because of time. But this is now, okay, it's a little bit better than I expected, but this is now the last experiment I want to talk about. And it's the experiment where I'm most involved in. It's a three participant experiment, so it's a multi-user experiment, which is a bit like an escape the room game, where participants need to, there's empty rooms in a museum, and participants need to place sculptures, artwork on pedestals. And we have two things we manipulate. Again, we manipulate the avatars, so how yourself and how the other participants look like, and uh, then we have one factor that we also manipulate. This is the input, but the input is a between subject factor, while the avatars, all other participants have either a realistic or a stylized avatar. Each participant has a different input device. We have one with a controller, one with a glove, and one with hand tracking. And then we have three rooms like this one here, and participants need to place all the sculptures on the correct pedestals together. And here's one room for the Roman Empire, a similar shaped room about ancient Greek and ancient Egypt. But otherwise, it's the same number of sculptures and so on. And the sculptures are placed at first on these robots, which are inspired by these vacuum cleaners. And the robots have specific numbers, and they can be controlled by a console that is standing in each room, and where there are joysticks to move these sculptures, and or here a slider to select a sculpture, and then to move them in front of a pedestal, and then the other two participants. So here's always one of the three controls the console, and in each room it's a different one. So in one room, the person with controllers uses the interactors. In the next room, the one with hand tracking, and the last one, for example, with gloves. Um, and the other two players are then there to lift together the sculpture and put it on a pedestal. You will see it in a second in a video how this can look like. Um, but first here, how, for example, here the avatar manipulations can look like. So we have four different avatar representations, like two realistic ones, two stylized ones, and two, like here they look like me. This a bit more than that one. I'm still working on the stylized versions. Or we have here the generic avatar. So this could be the avatars that I would then experience in the scenario. And then we can test, do we really prefer something that looks realistic and does it look like me? Or maybe we prefer something stylized, so it's less uncanny and so on. Although one important aspect here, these are just test avatars. In the end, the realistic avatars will be done a bit differently, where we will use Didimo. This is one of our partners here in present. And they have also their own method where we can take pictures and make avatars of these pictures. And this is more the style for the realistic avatars. But we don't just test like here the avatars, but we also test the input devices, and we want to show, for example, that the gloves enhance the VR experience. And for this, when I tested the gloves for the first time when they arrived in our lab, I immediately thought, okay, this is something where I want to be able to touch surfaces and feel them. I mean, this is a point of haptics, of course, but with touching, I mean hand physics. Like in standard VR, when you move your hand on to an object, the object will not block your virtual hand from moving through it. You can just move through it. It's actually quite tricky to implement this. Something that you can see here. So here I now block my hand, but the rest of the body is not behaving in the way that it's expected. And you need to have a lot of manipulations or adjustments to also have here the fingers not moving like that. I could talk about this for days. This is quite entertaining, but also frustrating at the same time. Um, but this is something we need. We want that the hand collides with the surface, and then the surfaces should have an individual haptic profile. And what I do here is here you can see here this red spot. There's at each finger, also here you can see it a bit. There are uh, raycasts attached to it, something you won't see in the experiment, but they are to detect the surface that you are touching with your finger, or there's also one at the palm. And what we can do then is we can use and read out information from the texture we apply, because usually there is not much geometry in 3D models. Most of the small details is something we do with textures. And one texture that I use here is so-called normal map. This is a depth texture, and this is, for example, what I also use to optimize these artworks. Like here is a sculpture which had originally 1.6 million triangles. Triangles are a bit like the pixel of 3D model, so it's a really high resolution model and too high for our purposes. And what I then did was I drastically reduced the resolution to just 3,500 triangles, and then what I did was baking this detailed information from this model into a texture that I can apply here. And then when I combine this model with that texture, we have almost the same kind of visual effect, but just a fraction of the processing that we need to do. And the good thing here is this kind of map is not only a map we can use for visuals, but it's essentially depth information about the model. So we can read out with these raycasts um, the value of the pixels here corresponding to a part of a model and then modulate the vibrations of the vibromotors with it. And what I do in particular, there are other people who tried or approach this kind of haptic surfaces already, and they usually use custom shaders, custom setups, and custom textures to define surface features. Where I think here, starting with a normal map is quite nice and neat because almost every properly rendered model should have a normal map applied. So it's already there. Um, but one aspect that is missing with normal maps, and that's it doesn't tell you something about if the surface is hard or soft, so it could be a carpet or piece of metal, and the normal map doesn't tell you anything about it. This is something we want to take into account with this haptic feedback. And what I do here is I leverage this so-called emission channel. This is something for most of the time you don't use emission, and emission is something where you can make things glow. So usually this would be a gray surface, but here I activated the emission and made this reddish tone, so it's glowing reddish. This is of course something we don't want, but for the moment we don't care, because what we just do is we use here. What I do is I have two channels. For red and for green, also blue channel, but I don't use it at the moment. And the red channel defines the baseline for the vibrations of the vibro motors, and the green channel defines the amplitude of it. So, for example, here this would be for a soft surface. We have high frequency, low amplitude, slow vibrations only. And we can read out this information to modulate, to how we modulate then, or we use this baseline, or I use this baseline and then modulate it based on the normal map. So for example, when there's more depth, when the amplitude goes in that spot a bit up. Um, but like I said, we don't want to have it red here, but the good thing is we can just go and uncheck this, and when the surface looks like it does, the information about the color channels is still here. So the neat thing here is we use shaders and tools from Unity that are already there. We don't need to create specific textures. Of course, you can do way more than I do right now here. But this is something it's easy to implement with low processing overhead, and I think it's quite neat. But So coming to my last slide, how does this all now look in action? So here it's just me alone. I didn't have other people to test it, but you can see here I can take my hand and put it on the surface, or I can grab here the interactors like the joystick and move it, or here the lever. But right now nothing happens. So right now there's nothing moves, and this is because here's no sculpture or no robot selected. So I select the slider here and move it to the position 2, and then I can move robot number 2, which is here Mark Aurelius is the name, and then I can move it to a pedestal, which is here on the side on the left side where the sculpture should be placed. So I can just move it over there with the joystick. I can go and change the height. Mm. And also rotate the sculpture in the correct orientation. And of course, here the interactors all have feedback. Like the joystick, the more you press it forward, the faster the robot goes and the stronger the vibrations are. Um, and then this would be done by two players. Here it's just me with two hands, but then the participants would take the sculpture and put it on the pedestal, and then it's placed, and then go on with the next game. This is basically the task, and they repeat. Um, and here this is something that we can then use not only to study like co-presence and so on, so how much did they have the feeling to share a space with others, etc. But we can also, for example, analyze the completion time. So we have one user with just with hand tracking where there is no haptic feedback, and uh, the other two conditions with controllers close have haptic feedback, and this I think can help to control these joysticks and to control the speed, etc. And we can, for example, test how long does the participant with hand tracking take, or the one with gloves, or how many collisions are with the robots and the environment and so on. And then in this way, we can gain information about which kind of input device is the best one in this context. And uh, with this, finally, I'm at the end, and thank you for your attention. Anyone still there? Or I'm already alone?
Yes. Thank you very much for your presentation, Mihail. It was super interesting.
So sorry for
Does
the
anybody have
overtime.
any immediate questions? Okay, I can start with a question. So I thought it was really interesting the experiment you were showing us with the fear-based one, where you basically measure presence by how how fearful somebody feels of the wolf in that environment. And I was wondering though how specific this is to fear. Wondering what would you use for something like social interaction instead? Like, could you use something like, I don't know, how curious you are about the person that you're talking to, or something that would be in principle, you wouldn't expect to feel fearful of the person that you were with. Hopefully not. I don't know. I'm wondering how you think, if you have any ideas of how you could extend this to social interaction.
I mean, in principle, yes, in principle, we can ask any kind of question. So, like, do you think the social interaction is now better? I don't know. It's always a lot of thinking to result phrasing. Like with the animals, we so often change the exact phrasing of this question. But in principle, we can ask any kind of thing here. I think it's then more what is a good manipulation for social interaction. And this is something where I would need to think about. But this is, I think, more the relevant party. But asking the question is something that we have flexibility to.
That's a good question. Yeah, I also have a question. Thank you for the talk, Michel. So I was thinking on the adaptive multimodal matching technique in a way, because people, they have to construct a desired outcome, or they are choosing, no? I was thinking on, do you think there is any possibility to use also EEG to map these transition points where they have surprise, or they need to choose another one, or I don't know. We never thought about that.
It could
But
totally be possible.
that's
I mean, we
possible,
can just like with stimuli on the display, we can measure exactly when we can send a trigger exactly at the moment to the EEG data when they make a decision, or when we change something before we ask them if they want to keep that. Especially with the plugin that we developed, this should be quite straightforward, I would say. It's interpretation, yes, again, but this is maybe more your business.
But do you think these signals are related to surprise in a way of the environment or prediction?
I would think so that you can do that. Although I would expect that surprise is probably something that, especially in the first times. So the more often you repeatedly see the same kind of configuration, switch back and forth, and of course the surprise would lower here. But this is again something where you need to depend on the design, on what you change in the environment, what factors you have.
Mhm. Thank you.
Come.
Okay, I'm looking for questions in the chat. I have another question. It's funny that the avatars that you were showing in the two factors, the more stylized ones, they always tend to look younger, right? And I wonder if that would have an effect.
Possibly, yes. This is something where my old stylized version, I think the age is quite okay, but for the other one, I fully agree that looks way younger. The problem is here, I think that the tools here for stylization that I found so far, they always include increasing the size of the eyes, and this is something so they will baby, small head, big eyes, so which makes the characters look younger. But yeah, this is something where definitely we would need to ensure with the avatars that we use eventually that they look more or less the same size, age, because otherwise it might be that participant chooses the other avatar because they want to feel young, for example.
For sure, for sure. Okay, does anyone have any more questions?
No.
No? I don't see questions either. Okay, well, thank you very much, Mihail. Thank everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
See you next week.
Yeah. Bye bye.